Okay, friends, colleagues, students, welcome to the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and the Melbourne School of Design here at the University of Melbourne. I'm Professor Donal Bates, and I'm the Associate Dean for Engagement, as well as the Chair of Architectural Design here at ABP. I begin proceedings by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which this event is taking place. The lands of the Wurundjeri, of the Woiwurrung people, members of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those emerging, and to all Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders witnessing this presentation. Here at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, we want to acknowledge and to affirm that Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders people have had and still have laws and laws that predate colonization. As built environment experts and design experts, we join in their responsibility to care for country and to thank our traditional custodians for sharing their knowledge. For this evening, we are very pleased to welcome all of you tonight for the exploration of the exhibition upstairs in the Dulux Gallery, Seeking Resonance, the Life Architecture of Gregory Burgess. I would like to thank Associate Professor Peter Raisbeck and lecturer Dr. Kirsten for their incredible hard work in delivering this program and particularly the exhibition. Special thanks also go to Tony Isaacson and the Robin Boyd Foundation for their tireless and dedicated support. Also thanks to Noel and Lindsay Henderson of Abington Merino, without whom this exhibition upstairs would not have been possible. And most of all, I would like to thank Gregory Burgess. We are honored to host the Seeking Resonance exhibition. It's a gift to our students, in particular, who will learn from observing Greg's craft. By engaging with questions of self that are offered in this exhibition, they have an opportunity to deeply reflect on who they are and how this can shape their own personal practice. Thank you to Greg for the months of work you have put into realizing this exhibition, to your dedication, which is an exemplar for all of us. A remarkable feature of Greg's practice is his skill for collaboration and participatory design. This exhibition has benefited from this approach, and the list of contributors is actually far too long to try to enumerate here. However, I would encourage you to check out the list of collaborators and acknowledgements at the entrance to the Dulux Gallery. This will be a conversation between Peter, Kirsten, and Greg, but there will be an opportunity at the end for questions and answers from the audience. So please be prepared. Now, I'd like to hand over to Peter and to Kirsten and to Greg for what should be an illuminating discussion. Thank you.
Donald, thank you so much, and it's so wonderful to be here. We've been working on this exhibition for more than 6 months, so I think, and certainly many collaborators. I thought I'd start and kick it off by speaking and reading out a little excerpt from the poster, which hopefully you should all be able to pick up from the exhibition space. I think for Greg, there is a correspondence between the seeking self and the building's capacity to gesture, speak, and resonate. He sees inner work and connection of body, soul, and spirit as key elements to enable creative presence. Life and work can then be filled with the drama of challenge and also open to generative, playful responses. Since the start of his practice in the 70s, this work has been at odds, I think, with prevailing trajectories of Australian architecture. These trajectories have by and large excised the supernatural, or the intangible if we want to call it that, the intangible world, instead preferring iconic capital and thinly disguised barefaced economics. That's my little bit of theory and polemic. But Greg's work is particular to ideas of place, circumstance and community, both intangible and tangible. And I think this exhibition evidences an architectural approach that we should come back to, an approach that materialises spirit and finds spirit in the material. Hence, for all of us, it is an exhibition that should not be seen simply as a collection of retrospective objects in a gallery, but in a way, a life world. So I think with those sort of profound statements, we'll get back to some more prosaic things, and we'll start with Kirsten and Greg, and maybe Kirsten and Greg, you'd like to talk a little bit about the archive, how it came to be, and what the relationship is between what we see at the Dulax Gallery, what we have at Abington, and of course the Knoll Shore exhibition over at the Baillieu Library.
Before we go to the archive, my question for Greg is, you've collected many things, and there have been lots of artists who've collected things. So Le Corbusier had an amazing collection of artefacts. David Bowie had an amazing collection of artefacts. You have a collection of models, drawings, office files, publications, sketches. There's a huge collection. In it, apart from, we'll get into what we have on the exhibition and what is at the Knoll Shore and what's at Abington. But to keep those things, because many architects, we only need to keep things for about 7 years and then we throw them out because it's no longer sort of part of our legal responsibility to keep them. But you have your models from your thesis and you have early projects from your first year about structures. You've kept all of these. Why have you kept these things?
Start with an awkward question.
Yeah. Well, you did ask for the difficult question, so...
Because I suppose it gets down to what you need to let go of and what you need to go forward with, to let things come. So those two questions come up, and I suppose my partner, Tanya, makes me very aware of some of these things about boxes and rooms and everything filled with so much stuff. And then there's a question of discernment. How do you value something? And what's the value? Sometimes you don't know the value of something for a long time. And especially something like this exhibition, looking back over time and your biography and the work, there's something about you're making sense out of your life, really. So I feel it's a double-edged thing, the collecting, the archiving, valuing, or sweeping clean and having a clean space to invite the new in. I think there's lessons there, both of why you keep, as long as you reflect and you're making sense of things, or why you let go, so you're clearing that new space for something new to come in.
When you moved from York Street, your offices in York Street, it was a fantastic opportunity for many of our students who were able to, because it was in between lockdowns and carefully managed by Catherine Wu and also by Dylan Webster, to organise students to come in who've actually seen models for the first time. And I think this is one of the wonderful things about having that collection, is that it goes from very sort of analogue ways of production, which is how we learnt, through to the digital. And so as part of that, there's this enormous range of media. We can still open tubes where you can still smell the dye line and just go, oh, I remember that from long ago. And having those collections of things, the models, the developments, the different types of materials, is really was quite an amazing experience for our students to be able to have access to those.
It's great to be able to offer that too.
Yeah.
I suppose what probably needs to be said here is that a couple of years ago when this process started, Tanya and I had been talking about the future and where we'd like to be or how we'd like it to be, and part of that conversation was selling York Street, my studio, and so that when that was decided, it came up, what's going to happen to my archive? It's, you know, and I was thinking about, well, what'll I keep? I sort of analysed down to a minimum, chucking all the models out, almost all the models out, what I would keep. But I also made some phone calls and to Donal Bates and Alan Pert, and there was some interest there because I was offering my whole archive as a cultural gift, and also to try and keep it together. I suppose that was one of my other reasons. And then Andrew Middleton from the university found Noel and Lindsay Henderson's shearing shed up near Kyneton as an interim storage area, and we've converted that into a gallery come storage for archive. And it's not just any old shearing shed, it's a DCM house and shearing shed. So that's very, it was like a sort of a life-saving.
I call it a miracle.
Miracle.
And total miracle, because when Andrew came and said, oh yeah, we can move the stuff to this shearing shed, I think we thought, oh my God, shearing shed. And then we went out there and found that there's a beautiful Denton Corker Marshall shearing shed. And then we had ideas that we're going to drive our cars full of the models to the shearing shed.
Yeah, and then we went to York Street and saw how many models there were.
And we thought, oh my God, how many models?
450 models.
And then Andrew Middleton said, oh, I've got this other guy who could help. His name's Tony. And I thought, Tony? Like what, what kind of name is that? But he said, oh, we'll get Tony on board. And Andrew said, if Tony comes on board, he'll take over. And so Tony Isaacson came on board, and that was really invaluable. And amazingly, I think as a team, I think I went on holidays at some point as usual, but as a team, everything clicked. Kirsten and the students handled the archival material of the move, and Tony then handled the actual move and also the fitting out of the shearing shed to make a really fantastic...
And the trucks.
And the trucks. He had the trucks. He had everything. He had Gabor, his helper. So that we wouldn't have done it. And I think, again, in that was the collaborative spirit. When Andrew Middleton said Tony's going to take over, I thought, well, we'll probably come to blows at some point. But it has actually been a really collaborative process, both the move and the exhibition, and we've all got on really well. I mean, it's extraordinary.
For months and months I've been waking up quite sick in the night with anxiety about what was going to happen to all this stuff, and trying to accept letting go. And so maybe that lesson hasn't been learned, but we're certainly looking at the value of things, why you would keep something or not.
So we do have 2 exhibitions that are running, because why do one when you can do 2? So at the North Shore Gallery is at the Baylieu. It's on the first floor, and that really focuses on the creation of the archive. So it's a much darker space than the Dulux, so we're able to include things like the Matterport that was created by the Robin Boyd Foundation, but also won the Bates Smart Media Award this year. which also takes through the how everything was laid out at York Street. And then we also have one that was put together by Belt of the collection at Avington, who are also about to do one of the collection down here. So you're able to sort of see how all the models were at York Street. Avington's really more about a collection, but there everything is safe and we're still sort of discovering things and...
There's container loads of files still to come.
Still to come. But wait, there's more. Go on.
It is I think it is one of Australia's most extraordinary architectural archives from the 1970s onward. And in saying that, I'm also comparing it to the Boyd Grounds Romberg Boyd archive at the SLV, which is mainly documents with no models. So I think this one is quite different. And I think also the volume of material that we have in this particular archival collection is much more extensive and much more in depth than even, say, the volume of material that they have at the RMIT Design Hub with the Corrigan archive, which I think kind of my segue to the next topic.
But before we go before we go to the next topic, I think that's also an interesting one too, because it becomes, so when we have the cultural gift, that was only for 6 projects out of hundreds of projects. And this becomes a very interesting issue about what do we do with architectural models? Can we just digitise them and then send them off into the cloud and they'll live there happily ever after? But you don't have the ability to sort of spin that around and to look into things. It's and it becomes, how do we start to store all that information? A lot of the stuff with the at the State Library goes missing. So it's also, you know, how do you keep a collection together? One of the initial conversations we had to Greg was to start to shortlist the projects, but because the models are in many ways like children, it's like, how do you get me to choose my favourite?
I think he came up with a different short list every day, and then it seemed to get longer and longer.
It did. So there's 6 projects that are at the Baillieu as part of the cultural gift, but we still have all these other projects that we need to figure out what we do, because our access at the collection at Avington is only for another 8 years. So, but let's go to the next part.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, we could talk about it. The model, I think when you go down to the exhibition and look at those models, or even if you go to Abington, you realise just how important model making is to architecture. And it's not the same as digital model making. It has a different relationship. So I think it's to the way that we view those models. But getting back to the point of archives, there's your archive, and then there's also the archive that the Peter Edmund and Corrigan archive at the Design Hub. But I think one of the things you'll notice in our exhibition is some posters from the 4 Melbourne architects exhibition from, I think, 1978, is it 1979. Greg Burgess, Norman Day, who's with us tonight, Peter Crone, who unfortunately passed away this year, and of course Peter Corrigan. And I think Greg, and of course Maggie, which I shouldn't forget, but Peter Corrigan was very generous to you at that point in time, and that was a really important moment. And some would say that exhibition was a really important moment in Australian architecture.
Yeah, Peter was very generous often. And he was repeated relatively regularly, I'm going to turn Australian architecture on its head. Do you want to come with me? That sort of, in various expressions, that came up as a kind of an invitation, but also not a threat, but a challenge, I suppose. So there was in Peter's life or destiny, he felt a very strong impulse to to go a different way and to have some colleagues to do it with. So there was a sort of a companionship, colleagueship with the Melbourne Four Architects that I think was a very lasting one, and something that I carry with a certain reverence and thanks.
And I recall you saying to me that for some of the early projects that you did, like Stockman's or maybe even Enshurst, both of which are in the exhibition down there, that Peter was incredibly encouraging to the kind of work that you were doing, which is, I think now when we look back on it, quite interesting, because Peter's work obviously quite different to what you were doing. How do you think Peter sort of perceived your work?
I think he was very, very conscious of, when looking at any work, he could be very dismissive if something was too mainstream or too reflecting what's being done. So there was I think, an encouragement to go your own way and to put the attention in, the intensity of attention to detail, and somehow coming through yourself, through one's own soul, if you like, and in that sense have an edge which was engaging critically with what was going on. And I think that's why he started digging into the suburbs. As a passion in the suburbs, like Richard Munday talked about it in his article in Architecture Australia. So I think there was inspiration in that, in Corrigan's striving, a kind of bravado in a way. And I felt the young one in the Melbourne Four, really, and a bit undercooked to go public. So that was a problem for me. It was a crisis for me. I was going through a crisis anyway, but Corrigan's invitation to join the Melbourne Four, or it was 6 or 8 at one point, his invitation threw me into turmoil, because I didn't know what the value of my work was. I felt untested in that sense, underconfident. So there was something there that reinforced that crisis, and I've had a blockage, and I started writing everything that sort of mattered to me, just try and get a connection, to get grounded again, to take this on and to look back and look with courage about what I've been doing. So in doing this writing, it seemed to unblock, and I started to flow again. So I think the personal and one's vocation as an architect are very important, how they're working off each other, and something to be conscious of. Because as somebody said, if we want to understand the meaning of our lives, we look at our biography. And I think that's true. That's one of the things that I've derived from this archival exercise, is valuing things and putting things together, trying to order your life into what matters and what doesn't. And it involves relationships, your inner work, your work as an architect, your vocation, and how you work with people. And where are we? What's the world needing at the moment? I think these are all challenging questions which shift as you unfold in your own life, how you engage with these issues and shifts. Yeah.
Do you think that preparing for that exhibition and now preparing for this one has been a similar process?
Similar, and they've both been crises. And yeah, it's new territory. It's sort of not just putting stuff out because you've done it, but trying to make sense of it as you're putting it out, And that's where the concept for the exhibition, I suppose, was important. What does it mean? So there's a number of main elements there. The figure of 8 or the lemniscate, the flow form, the water pulsing, that heartbeat of the water pulsing, the labyrinth, the journey as you move towards the centre, quite close to it but far away, that sort of irony of journey and pilgrimage, point and periphery, these sort of concepts of which are universal principles, but how do they apply in our own lives? How do we work with them? And I suppose I really wanted to share some of these principles in relation to the work with this exhibition. That's part of its my sense of meaning in it. I mean, you wouldn't do something like this if you didn't believe there's something there to share. So I hope and quite a few students have spoken to me about getting it. So I feel it's fantastic, even just to get some of that feedback, that young people get it. And I suppose it's different too to what's currently being done and how it's being done, but I think there's value in that too.
One of the parts of the exhibition, Greg, is the section where you've got some poems. There's a poem from your partner, Pip Stokes, and who's no longer with us, and then a picture of Walter, Marion and Walter the Griffins, and then also a poem on the other side from yourself, and then in between that there's some of the art from Pip, and also this incredibly kind of flimsy sort of bridging model that sort of crosses a cleave of rock. And I think when you go to the exhibition you should really have a look at this little section, because it's embedded deep in the exhibition, and I think it's incredibly personal. And I think I spoke to Greg a bit about this today, so you've been warned. Do you want to reflect on your collaboration with Pip? Because when you see those two poems, you think they're somehow linked, but they're quite independent, and there's a kind of freedom in that as well.
Rilke's description of ideal relationship as adjacent solitude, I think, comes in here as a consideration. I think also, just putting Pip's work and life in perspective, she was her mother was institutionalised when she was 7, and so she had childhood leukemia, but she survived, which was one of the few people to survive it. But there was something in that experience that she had an epiphany about being an artist, watching a man painting in the garden at the hospital where she was for a long time. So there's something there about one's biography again, which has bearing then on her PhD, which she completed the year before she died, which was on care, the poetics of care. And with myself, before the Melbourne 4 architects, my brother had suicided, and there was a number of traumas in my life, including, I was offered a place as a healer with a priest, and that made me think about architecture as having a healing dimension. Why don't I bring it? So I didn't take his offer up, but I did begin to think about architecture differently as a vehicle for healing. So there's something in in one's destiny, I suppose, about and with Tanya now we're beginning to work together, bringing architecture and healing together too, and self-development. So I think there's in my understanding, there's something important about keeping open to what it is coming next. Even at my age, I'm feeling quite excited about this exhibition, working and collaborating, but also on what's coming up, what's coming out of it. It's it's not like a it's not an end. It's a new beginning somehow.
I think with that as that set of themes about care, it's been interesting working through the collections of models, because they're not just about the fully formed, beautiful roofs. There are a number of staircases and places that have lots of skylights, contemplation spaces, and really sort of thinking about how a model or a staircase might work, how the light comes in, how that penetrates, how things happen around a space, and what that sense of journey is. I'm thinking particularly with the Hackford House and that sense of a homecoming and approach. So these are concepts that are beyond just, here's my sort of groovy external form. There is that sort of deep consideration about what spaces do and what spaces mean, the sense of colour and appreciation.
I think too, say with that Hackford House, which was designed around the same time as the exhibition, just very close to that time, which was a period of transition and transformation personally. I was interested in the notion of homecoming, or longing for home, which is maybe a less specific thing, but I think that's a key quality in our lives and in our psyches, our souls, that carries us or draws us, or it's an appetite or a wish and a will to connect to what we really need to connect to for our own development.
On that sense of connection, I'm interested in, because the conversations that we've had over the months about how you prepare yourself, and I guess this is then sort of leading into a lot of your Indigenous work. How do you prepare yourself to be able to be in the moment, to be able to understand what people are talking to you or discussing with you, particularly with some of their very careful concerns about what, like the idea of homecoming, or that longing for homecoming, how you then start to translate that into a set of experiences or architecture? I hope that question made sense.
Yeah, well, I think a key aspect there is being able to embody qualities, or to be able to articulate qualities in form. You know, whether it's just a gesture of the building to the world, to people, to the world. I think that's a key capacity to develop, and I suppose that's where, in teaching sometimes with students, to talk about the building as self, the building as embodying human qualities that are very powerful in their effect on others. So I think that's a key aspect to understand and work with.
And that was one of the things that we were often talked about as we were preparing the exhibition, particularly in that northern section of the Dulux, with what we called the stations, with those images on the wall, that the idea was that they would be images that were somehow resonate in the sense of, I suppose, different states or different qualities, and that the exhibition would not be a sort of binary exhibition in a sense. Does that make... Yeah,
I think
that's sort of what we were
most of
talking
these
about.
stations, like Stations of the Cross, they're moments of pause and reflection.
We called them Greg stations after a while, sorry.
Yeah,
but
a lot of them are about polarity, about two different qualities dancing, or the middle space, what's happening in the overlapping space, the vesica. So they're most of them hold, we call them engaging or encounters with spirit and matter. So that thing about spirit being in matter, matter being in spirit, spirit becoming matter, matter becoming spirit, they're kind of ambiguous, or so there's something there important about the two things at once, not just one thing, not binary, but the polarity in dance. So that was behind that, the stations, the loop of the stations in the north end of the gallery.
do you want to say a bit more about the chair? Because, I think for me, for myself and Kirsten and other collaborators, we didn't actually know what was going to be there till the very last moment, and then there was
There's a lot in there that we didn't know was going to be there till the very last
moment. Do you want to say a little bit about the chair?
I think that was just suggested itself as a moment where you become maybe the station, the way that you fit into the world, claiming your spot. Please sit or please look. The mirror and the chair, they're kind of, they're participatory items that mean something very different if you sit in it or you just look at it and think, what's that about? So you maybe sit with a new viewpoint, you're lower, you're looking this way, you're looking that way. The mirror, obviously, who am I? I mean, this is behind the whole exhibition, as it was the first time. Who am I? Where am I from? Where am I going? Just that kind of, those very deep, difficult questions that we struggle with our whole lives. So
There's also an element of exposure. So it's not here's my fabulous finished building, aren't I clever? There's a number of things that you're expressing and exposing by not just sort of saying, well, here's the facade. There's other things behind that. Is it easier to be to sort of show that, or?
yeah, I think there's something like the chair is a very old chair, got marks of its life, like we have, flaws, and so there's something there about. Yeah, I had a good thought there, but I've lost it.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Now we have a very big labyrinth. How does the labyrinth fit in as part of this exhibition?
Well, Labyrinth came from working a lemniscate, joining the two spaces. That's how it originally started. We did develop a physical lemniscate with Julian Featherstone. A magnificent thing, was all ready to hang, and we couldn't do it, but which was quite very unfortunate. A lot of time went into that. But the lemniscate joining the two ends of the gallery, in one of those loops at the southern end, I saw the labyrinth being somehow grounding itself out of the lemniscate, and I was playing with the dimensions of the gallery and found that the larger gallery was the exact diameter of the Chartres labyrinth. And because Chartres Cathedral is very important in my life, I started doing the Vesica Pisces sacred geometry in the space and found that that sort of worked too. And so there was a sort of a moment, as often happens when you're intensely involved in unfolding something. It made sense in a personal sense and in a physical sense in the building. So it was connecting the building here with Chartres Cathedral, which is important to me, and also to the principle of journey, beginning and the centre, and the mystery of the labyrinth, you know, the way you move very close to the centre but you're not really there, you move out and you move back, and somehow there's a principle there of pilgrimage too. So it sort of came about in quite an organic way, and I just went with that. And it's we were going to do a collective or collaborative labyrinth too with masking tape, but we ended up doing the vinyl version.
I mean, the lemniscape was something that we spent a lot of time in the design process as we were collaboratively working through what the exhibition would be like. And as you enter the exhibition and go over to the room on the south... Greg's room, we're calling it Greg's room. Got a few questions about Greg's room. On the south, is it south? Oh, southwest. There's a bench which has all of Greg's sketches, a couple of my sketches thrown in as well, I should say, that shows the development and the ideas that we sort of talked about, particularly with the lemniscape, which would have been a fantastic structure looping up over 3 or 4 stories above into the void of the MSD building, then coming down, crossing down.
Like 11 or 12 metres.
Yeah. And what was really amazing, I think, Greg, is that I think it was, when was it? January, I can't remember, February, we started talking about lemniscape. It took me a couple of weeks to work out what it was and what he meant, and then I had to ring up Kirsten and say, what is this lemniscape? Is it like lemon? I don't really know what it was. And Kirsten obviously has done a PhD in other things, which, you know, knows what these kinds of symbols are. And then, oh, right, so that's what it is. And I think what I found amazing is at some point you came in with a sketch of a section, which I think is on that bench, and it was just like whoosh. And I think as we went on and talked about what we realised, it was spot on in terms of proportions, in terms of where it might sit in that space, and you know, I guess how it would actually work in relation to the plan underneath. And it just seemed to me to be, compared to my stilted sketches, like an amazing sort of gesture that you'd introduced with such felicity and skill. And I suppose that's the question. Over the years, do you think you've got better at measuring things, at envisaging things in architectural terms, and, you know, better at doing your sketches?
I think it's in the area of flow or inspiration and being a vehicle for bringing something in rather than trying, or there's something about preparing yourself to be in a receptive state to let something come through you, and whatever it is that comes through is what you're inviting, is what's needing to be, what's needing to come through you, like as almost like a midwife, or and preparing yourself in that way. So I don't know that it's is it a skill, or is it just being in the right state, preparing yourself to be in the right state to bring something in. So it's to do with flow, I think.
Do you think that's also helped you when, because throughout the whole collection there's a number of cultural projects. So we've got the Gateway for Victoria Street, there's the Catholic Theological College, there's the large number of Indigenous projects that you've done. That ability to be able to connect with people has enabled you to work through, because there's a lot of symbols and images and stories that come with those projects that you seem, from my perspective, you've navigated quite deftly.
Mm. Yeah, I'm very interested in complex things. I like the challenge of impossibility, not impossibility, but very difficult. I sort of enjoy sensing out what's the essence of things, or what's the quality of things, what's the question of what's really needed here. And sensing that out rather than hammering in there. But it's probably quite a feminine aspect of the work, of being receptive and sensing rather than grabbing and ramming or whatever.
Which I think gets to our discussion that we'd like to have with you before we go to questions about the Uluru project. And I think now that when we reflect back on these things in terms of contemporary practice, we can see, the poetics of care or the discourse of care was certainly something that is now quite prevalent. We can see now that these issues around country are now issues that architects are really seriously beginning to address. And, community consultation and that sort of aspect of your work is now also coming to the fore. Tell us a little bit about how you consulted with a Nungu community at Uluru, the story of it, because I think it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, I suppose it was a time where there wasn't very many precedents to refer to, so myself and the few people that went up initially to Uluru were winging it a bit, not just winging it, but in that same sense of preparing, for me anyway, preparing with meditation and prayer, and so just being awake, setting up a studio in the Mutijulu community. So we had a lot of dropping in and getting to know people, commissioning paintings, a women's painting, a law painting, Chukapa painting, and speaking, walking, hunting, gathering with the community, people in the community, talking, sitting on the ground, drawing in the sand with particularly the women. The women were very powerful there, and as was Jamawa, who was the key lawman and Christian pastor as well, had that double going. So there was you'd call it a sort of casual looking unfolding of getting trust and connecting with people, relationships. So there's a familiarity and a warmth and trust developing. Being trusted with the stories, and I suppose the stories really are the gifts that Indigenous communities or people have, and the certain people have responsibilities for carrying the song lines, if you like, for a certain distance, and then somebody else, and then somebody else. So we were trusted with sitting down around an aerial photo of Uluru to mark around the base of the rock, Uluru, all of the events from the Chukapa time. So there was, and a key moment, I mention this because it's sort of somehow the heart of the whole experience there, was Nellie Patterson, one of the elder women who did the women's painting, was talking about the Anangu and the White Rangers working together as one for this project, for this building, and she did that sign with her hands, which was like a sort of a cosmic sign, really, the birth of a nebula or a double spiral. And I drew that in the sand immediately because I saw it as I'd been working with those forms that morning, and it just seemed the synchronicity, which was part of the experience of living at Uluru, and the power of the landscape, which is very charged with human consciousness, was a most unusual experience. It was a life-changing experience of, and again, of giving over to that. So that motif became a key for the whole building. That form became Liru and Kunia, or the two sacred snakes, as was identified by members of the community. So that became both the overall form of the two buildings, locking together like that, and in detail what was happening. So there's a different sense of time there, the synchronicity of things happening at the right time and experiencing that and seeing that and knowing that. I think that was one of the central important experiences there. Time being different, the psychic capacity of the people, some still having very strong psychic capacity. In fact, Jamawa tested me out by penetrating his psyche into me, and I didn't like it, and I let him know, and that was okay. But so this is all transitional cultural stuff too. We're experiencing the latter end of traditional Indigenous culture as it is globally. But it was a very real privilege of an experience working there. And maybe that's enough, just give a bit of a sense.
I think in time of the climate crisis and climate emergency, I think it does point to the importance of I would say listening to the voice of the earth through First Nations experiences, and I think
Jamawa, said a number of times, you have to listen to the land with your heart, because the knowledge is always there, always will be there, but you have to listen with your heart. And that was his kind of teaching, I suppose, or something that he gave to us with the stories.
Well, I think it's nice to have a silence after that story. It's perfectly all right. We might go to questions, I think, now. I think we've extracted quite a lot out of Greg, so it might be good to see if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, we'll move to some questions for the audience, but first, before we do that, I do want to thank Peter and Kirsten for being part of this conversation, but particularly for Greg for opening up to this opportunity. I mean, when we were both with the opening of the exhibition, but particularly with this evening's event, Greg particularly didn't want to just give another lecture, which I'm sure he's given thousands, if not more than that. So I think the event really for this evening was really to try to be very open about the kind of conversation and the deliberations and the sort of processes as opposed to objects, but talking about sort of ways in which the work itself is developed. So really, this is open now, so if you could, we have one mic, so we're going to have to run. Philippa's going to have to do a lot of running right now. So we have one here on the first row.
Fantastic. I have a question about Uluru. I hope this is right. Tell us about the tree. Because I've never been to Uluru, but I'd never imagined trees there. And if I'm right, there is a tree and then several others that are there.
There's a lot of trees, yeah. But the particular tree that the women identified as being, it was a dead tree, about 1,000-year-old desert oak. The women identified that as the centre of the whirly, as they called it. Could be the centre of the building. So it was located in the space between the two buildings. And it was very dead and very big and had many juvenile she oaks around its base. So there was this death and rebirth quality happening at the site the women identified with. And I used the trees actually in conversation with the site, with dowsing, as starting points and reference points for what the building needed to do, which surprised me in the end, actually, to find out what was happening. It made sense to, I don't know, but I was very surprised by what came out of the dowsing when you're open in that way. So the trees are a very important part of that, but the 1,000-year-old dead oak was really the centre of the whole complex.
And then the trees that are within the building, is that correct?
There is...
There's forms in the building.
The structural timber, yeah. That's... they're white ant resistant native pine. So there's two different trees. There's trees on the site and there's trees made, and radially sawn timber actually. It's all sort of special timber.
What do engineers say when they see you coming with these drawings?
Well, a structural engineer has done a lot of our work. There's Peter Yitrup, who should be celebrated. He's done some fantastic work, especially with timber and earth, because the building's made out of sand from the site. So some engineers eat it up, you know. Yeah. And most builders and most consultants are under challenged. So people get excited about good challenge.
I can say that's also one of the interesting things that we've found in the collection as well, is the number of books and things that have been made by the different manufacturers that have worked with Greg in celebration of the types of the timber that they've done for different projects. And it's just, wow, it's quite impressive.
Yeah, we could talk about that. There's a lot of design innovation in the collection, and there's 500, is it 450 CD-ROMs, which also makes the collection really important, because if we took a longitudinal, or we took a transect through all those ROMs and got into them, I think we'd be able to see how digital computing has sort of developed from, the 80s through to now. Now, there's a question there.
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part question. I liked what you said about architecture as healing, or having those healing qualities, and I think increasingly with developments and quite fast architecture, it's being lost. So I was wondering what your opinion, or what you meant by architecture as healing, and possible ways to integrate that into sort of the new architectural practice. And then sort of sidelining that, also in terms of like designing for country and engaging with, the Indigenous culture and ways to do that in other ways other than sort of cosmetic ways. People sort of tend to just get art and slap it on a building, and that's that's our give back to the making of place. But what sort of deeper sort of philosophies, I guess, could be integrated in?
Yeah, I suppose Uluru there's a picture at Uluru where various artists from the community painted the walls of the building as a means of explaining why it wasn't a good idea for visitors to climb the rock. And that's now been, I think October last, or a couple of years ago, that's people don't climb the rock anymore. So that came out of initiative of the community painting the reasons why in the building. So that was a very healing process, sort of unlikely in some way, but that was a healing process that visitors stopped climbing the rock, because that was the source of anxiety and responsibilities that they didn't want to have. Many people died on the rock, accidents and heart attacks, and so that's a version of process that's healing, I think. But I suppose in a more general sense, healing is the result of just being consciously forming spaces, and how one can use colour, how you're conscious of the space between things, what's linking things across space, allowing space to become rather than just be something that holds physical stuff. You know, how is it charged with a connecting energy or an arc? So there's a sort of creative tension, I think, important for healing and buildings, rather than sort of dead. So, yeah, what does that mean? There's something about the inner attitude that we have as architects that's important there, so that you're open to other dimensions rather than just what's in front of you, or so trying things, I suppose, intuiting and being aware of what is well-being for the human body, soul and spirit.
Well, I think that's the first part of your question.
There's a question on the back row there, Philippa.
I just thought I'd make a microphone bearer run all the way to the back of the room. Thank you for the discussion. There's a lot of lovely language around the unfolding of ideas and emergence, I guess. And I wonder how we find the source from which these forms, ideas, approaches come forth. And maybe that's a question about how we listen to place as a participant in engagement processes or the design process. Reflecting on the models, the exhibitions, these projects, what have you learned, in a nutshell, I suppose, about how we might listen to place to enable that kind of process of unfolding to actually happen?
Well, again, I use Uluru as an example, in that it was very charged with human consciousness there. So it's something about the deep listening for presence, carrying questions perhaps that need to be answered, that can come, like Jamua said, from the land itself, if you listen with your heart. So listening with the heart, what does that mean for each of us? So listening is about connection. So there's something there important about connecting with place, the many dimensions of place. You know, the insects, the trees, the birds, the snakes, all the little crawlies that are around. How does that all come together? I suppose what the Chukapa is, the law, is the way personal biography, the so-called dream time, how all that comes together, the song lines. It's a very complex, integrated picture that that's unravelling, I suppose, as we know, and this is quite tragic through the whole world. And it's why we have to keep trying in our own way to sense into place, to the best of our capacity, because our psychic capacities are sort of withering because we don't use them much. But it's certainly something for education to consider, I think, this whole thing of self-development and sensibility, sensitivity, responsiveness. I think a lot more emphasis on that aspect of life and could be very transforming for architecture and the world. It's what's needed. There's a lot of carelessness in architecture, which isn't doing much to support positive change or healing or even just life-enhancing qualities in space and place.
Mm.
So the way it all comes together, I think, is an important part of, and your point about what is the source. I suppose this is, and there's something there in my experience and about one's own will and the larger will. How do they align? How do we become more effective through combining the divine and the human, if you like? I mean, you can use all sorts of different words, but that will aspect, I think, from my understanding in relation to your question, is the big one, the will. Mm. The nature of will, the nature of surrendering to will in a discerning way, and being open and being connected and being available in that way.
I just want to pick up on one of the points that you have, that you mentioned, which sort of ties in with that. But when your buildings are tied in with Chukupa laws and things like that, is there that sense of responsibility that you feel about the design, about what you've created with this group, that then becomes embedded in sort of their sense of identity and law and part of this, the new song lines or expanding the existing song lines?
Yeah, well, I suppose we need to remember that I was one person in a group too, and it was very collaborative in a very deep sense with members of the community. It wasn't sort of like the architect does the plan. It was actually very, that's what I was saying about synchronicity. There's a whole lot of factors that were saying you're on the right track here, working together. So something new and fresh is something very old and ancient, and something that had the thread of continuity with the past and connecting with the future. So there's certainly a question of any of these buildings of, well, change is needed. These buildings are 30 years old or more. How does it work when you change something, and what do you keep in terms of the thread of continuity, respect for culture, what still matters, what doesn't, and who says? Yeah.
Philippa, do we have any more? Yes.
Thank you. That's a wonderful building up at Uluru. I recommend everybody go and have a look. When Brigitte and I were walking.
I've got to say, the exhibition team, collaborative team with Greg, Tony, me, Kirsten, I think Michaela here in the audience, DJ, even Norman might come along, Tanya. We were thinking of going on a road trip.
Okay. So there were goannas walking around when we went outside, and we went back in and had another look, and it's just a wonderful building. I have a question about the Platypus house at the Hillsville Sanctuary. Been there lots of times with overseas visitors and our kids, and they all go and have a look at the platypus, and then I often wander off and have a look at the sort of cathedral, mini cathedral church-like atmosphere in there. I was wondering if you could give us a few thoughts about designing and, you know, that building in so much as it being a public building, but it's always in the dark and people just go through it quickly. Do you have any ideas about what it looks like during the daytime, or do you try not to go and have a look at it in the daytime, or is it? How do you feel about it, Greg? Thank you.
Well, I suppose it's very light dimmed because of the nocturnal habits of the platypus. They're nocturnal creatures, so the light levels. You're suggesting, Terry, that you can't see anything.
No, there aren't many. There's a lot of nocturnal houses around in zoos, but usually they're just, you know, pretty utilitarian, you know, to put it bluntly. And there's a lot of thought gone into that one because it's organic shapes, and you know. So I've seen the platypus numerous times, and after your eyes adjust, you can see a lot of the building as well. And it's mud brick, I understand, or pisé, I'm not sure.
And what?
It's pisé or mud brick, isn't it, the building?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just wondering if you could reflect upon your design of it a little bit. Did you set out to do it in mud brick, pizza, or were you encouraged to use timber, or what? How did it end up being like that, Greg?
It seemed to unfold out of the patterns of water. So there was like a plaiting quality to it, a movement that reflects the movement of water, and subdued light, and I suppose a transition zone both in and out that gradually get you used to lower light levels, so that by the time you're inside the building, your eyes have adjusted to see what's going on. I haven't been there for quite a long time, so I probably needs treatment or something.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And go encourage your friends to see the exhibition. There's a lot to unpack in it. It's pretty dense. There's so many projects, quite a few we haven't even touched on or talked about.
It's about a quarter of the whole archive is in the exhibition. So
I think it's 100 models when in the archive. There's about 450. Donal.
So, yeah, just to wrap up, first I want to thank everybody who's here for attending this special event tonight. As Greg and Peter just alluded to, actually, this is actually quite a unique exhibition in the sense of it's incredibly dense. I don't think we've ever had an exhibition in the Dulux Gallery that had so many objects, but it's not an object exhibition, it's actually an ideas exhibition. And so I think it's one that requires repeated visitation in order to both absorb the variety and the sort of chronology. I mean, because it's also a huge sort of time span in which the work takes place. So it is an exhibition that I think you have to go back to over multiple occasions in order to really start to incorporate some of the ideas in the work, but also to understand how the formal expression of those has emerged. And so please come again as many times as you can to see the exhibition while it's up. But we also hope to see you at some of the forthcoming exhibition program events, which are on our website for details. So for instance, Greg will be delivering a series of floor talks within the Dulux Gallery. The first one coming up will be on the 29th of September, which is a Thursday, so next Thursday. And then on the 5th of October and the 12th of October, both of which are on Wednesdays. These are events that are open to come in where Greg will be, in a certain way, illuminating in more detailed explication about some of the work and some of the projects that are within that. And there are booking links for all of these events that are available on the Melbourne School of Design website. But I particularly wanted to make you aware that Greg will be presenting a small group workshop in association with Tanya Colburn who's an educator, writer, and storyteller with expertise in spiritual psychology, conflict resolution, and transformative mediation. Greg and Tanya will guide participants through a process of self-reflection. The workshop will be held on Saturday, the 8th of October, in the Dulux Gallery, the exhibition space upstairs. And you can register your interest in this by emailing msd-exhibitions@unimelb.edu.au. And finally, again, just to thank Kirsten, Peter, and Greg for forming this panel and for being here tonight. And we want to wish all of you a really wonderful evening, and thank you for participating.